My name is Rachel, and this is a difficult story from my life, one that nearly destroyed everything. It's odd how situations can quickly worsen when you're not prepared, and how a person you rely on can abruptly turn into someone you don't even know. It all began simply enough. My husband, Michael, and I had been married for 8 years. We owned a lovely house, had good jobs, and our beloved golden retriever. Max was like our kid. However, like many marriages, ours encountered problems. We were still a couple, but emotionally, we had grown distant. Michael was working long hours, and I frequently felt ignored and forgotten, as if I was fading away in my own house. I wasn't aware of how weak I was until John entered the scene. John was Michael's closest friend and a regular visitor to our home. He had been a part of our lives for a long time. He and Michael played basketball together, and the three of us would often have dinner, chatting about everything from everyday life to sports and work. But as time passed, John and I began to form a connection that felt different. It wasn't planned, at least not at first. At first, we swapped silly jokes, maybe giggling a little too much. As time went on, I looked forward to Joan's visits, and our easygoing talks became more personal. We talked about our problems, and before long, I told John secrets I hadn't even told Michael. I liked how attentive John was. He noticed little things like my new hairdo and the way I dressed, things Michael didn't seem to see anymore. It felt good to be appreciated again. But I told myself it would just be a friendship, nothing more. Then, one Friday night, things changed. Michael was at work late, like always, and Joan stopped by to help fix some things around the house. My dog, Max, was happy, as usual, jumping all over Joan, wagging his tail and barking. Everything seemed normal, but something felt different between John and me that night. Something I could see in his smile and the way his hand brushed against mine. While we chuckled, fixing a broken kitchen cupboard together, an unspoken strain was building. It started small, barely noticeable, but it was definitely present. After we finished the repairs, we relaxed on the sofa with Max, our dog, nestled between us, watching television. The atmosphere was heavy, like something was about to occur, but neither of us initiated anything. Suddenly, out of the blue, Jean's hand covered mine. It wasn't forceful, yet it wasn't exactly a gesture of friendship either. It was different, more significant. I should have moved my hand, or even left, but I froze. His touch sent a chill through me, and for a brief moment I forgot everything else. It was as if my brain stopped working, and I only felt the heat of his hand. Max, at our feet, stirred a little, but remained quiet, as if he sensed the awkwardness. Then, the reality of the situation hit me hard. I heard the front door being unlocked downstairs. My heart pounded as Michael entered, totally oblivious to the scene he'd stumbled upon. John rapidly retracted his hand, and I leaped off the sofa, my cheeks burning with shame. The whole thing occurred in a flash, but the atmosphere was incredibly strained. "Hi, I'm back," Michael said nonchalantly, placing his keys on the table. "What's happening?" "Nothing," I blurted, my voice unusually shrill. "We were just watching television." John rose as well, obviously just as uneasy as I was. "Yeah, I was just leaving," he mumbled, averting his gaze from Michael. Michael seemed to miss the awkwardness between us, or perhaps he was simply too exhausted to bother. He went over to Max and began stroking him. For a short time, I believed we were safe. Perhaps Michael hadn't seen or heard anything. Perhaps this whole thing would just disappear, and we could forget it ever happened. But in my heart, I understood that wasn't true. Something had changed between John and me. something permanent. We hadn't been physically intimate, but emotionally, we were right at the limit, and I was scared of what might come next. When Joan departed that evening, he looked at me in a way that showed he felt the same as I did. This situation was far from finished. That's when I understood I was in serious trouble. The days after that were a jumble of mixed-up feelings and shame. I constantly thought about John, his touch, the way he was always there, how he made me feel seen, but each time I thought of him, I felt a strong pang of guilt. Michael hadn't done anything to deserve this. He was a kind and loving spouse, though preoccupied and weary. Certainly, he didn't merit the betrayal he was unknowingly experiencing. I attempted to dismiss it, telling myself it was a brief lapse in judgment. Nothing significant. However, despite my efforts to suppress it, Joan's presence was constant. He'd send me casual messages, inquiring about my well-being or my son Max's behavior. It wasn't overtly suggestive, but the underlying meaning was obvious. He hadn't forgotten our shared indiscretion either. I understood I ought to have disregarded him, yet I didn't. Honestly, I relished the notice, and this acknowledgement made me loathe myself all the more. Each time I responded, I felt I was courting danger, but I was powerless to cease. The situation escalated one night when Michael, my husband, suggested inviting John for dinner. It had been some time since the three of us hung out, and I couldn't say no without seeming strange. So, I faked a grin and acted like all was well. But inside, I was falling apart. Dinner was uncomfortable, at least for me. Michael and John were their normal selves, chuckling, discussing sports, and telling work tales. But I couldn't pay attention. Every time John glanced at me, I felt exposed, like he knew my secret. And every time Michael beamed at me, I felt incredibly guilty. After we ate, we went into the living room, Max, our pet, following close behind as usual. John took a seat on the sofa, and I paused briefly before sitting beside him, making sure to leave a clear space between us. Michael was in the kitchen, washing dishes, totally unaware of the strained atmosphere between John and me. Then, in a moment I'll always remember, Max leaped up onto the couch right between John and me, just like he had the night before. He was wagging his tail, oblivious to the emotional storm brewing in the room. John chuckled and reached over to pet him, and for a split second, his hand brushed against mine again. It was like déjà vu, but this time, I pulled away. Instantly, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't do this anymore. I stood up abruptly, startling both Jean and Max. "I'm going to help Michael in the kitchen," I said, my voice shaky. I needed to get out of there. The walls were closing in, and I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of my own guilt. John didn't say anything. He just nodded, his expression unreadable in the kitchen. I found Michael drying dishes, humming softly to himself. He looked so blissfully unaware of the emotional disaster unfolding behind his back. I watched him for a moment, and the guilt hit me like a freight train. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. "Hey, can I talk to you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Michael turned to me, his smile fading when he saw the look on my face. "What's wrong?" I hesitated, my mind racing. Should I tell him the truth? Should I confess everything and risk losing him forever? But as I stood there staring into his concerned eyes, I realized that I couldn't not like this. The truth would destroy him, and I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready to tear our lives apart. "Nothing," I lied, forcing a smile. I've been feeling a little off lately. Work's been stressful." Michael relaxed, clearly relieved. "You know you can talk to me about anything." "Right," he said, pulling me into a hug. "I'm here for you." His embrace felt like a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge. And in that moment, I made a decision I was going to end whatever was happening with Jean. I couldn't keep walking this dangerous line, risking everything for something that wasn't worth it, but fate had other plans. The next day, I texted Jean telling him we needed to talk. I wanted to be clear, this needed to stop. I wasn't going to risk my marriage for a fleeting attraction, no matter how strong it felt. He agreed to meet up, but instead of suggesting a public place, he asked if he could come over when Michael wasn't home against my better judgment. I agreed. When John arrived, Max greeted him excitedly, as usual, oblivious to the tension in the air. I led Joan into the living room, determined to have a serious conversation. I needed to set boundaries. I needed to end this before it went any further, but John had other ideas. As soon as we sat down, he leaned in closer than I expected. His eyes locked on mine. "Rachel, I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his voice low. "And stop thinking about you." He confessed, his voice low and intense. My heart raced, but I shook my head. "John, this is wrong. We can't do this. I love Michael." I know, he said, his hand reaching for mine again. But I can't help how I feel. I pulled my hand away, standing up to put some distance between us. "This has to stop. We can't keep doing this." Joan stood up to put some distance up too, frustration clear on his face. "Rachel, you feel it too." "I know you do." Before I could respond, the sound of the front door unlocking sent a wave of panic through me. Michael was home early. I hadn't expected him for another hour. John froze, his eyes wide with shock. I could hear Max barking excitedly from the hallway. As Michael stepped inside, my heart pounded in my chest. As I realized the situation we were in, there was no way to explain this without it looking bad. Michael walked into the living room, his face lighting up when he saw me until he noticed John. His expression shifted immediately, confusion and suspicion clouding his features. He looked from me to Jen and back to me again, his brow furrowing. "What's going on?" Michael asked, his voice cautious but sharp. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The guilt was overwhelming, and I knew there was no way to explain this without it sounding like exactly what it was: a betrayal. John, sensing the tension, quickly spoke up. "I was just leaving," he said, his voice too casual. "I came by to check on Max." Michael's eyes narrowed as he looked between us, clearly not buying the excuse. "Why would you need to check on Max when Rachel's home?" The room was silent, and at that moment, I realized that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't undo what had